While surfing on the web one day, in a most whimsical way, I was taken by surprise by some whirling wind and ice. I was eager to learn about hot air today. Thank you very much. But, what did I learn? Let us explore together, shall we? It is exciting. This is the headline I came across. A bomb cyclone, Menace, could challenge the most intense North Atlantic cyclones on record this weekend. Expected to bottom at around 915 millibars and push a severe windstorm towards Western Europe. But 915 millibars, what does that even mean? Let's try to put some numbers behind that. Here's another fun headline from severe-weather.eu, one of my favorite sources for weather news. Planning Valentine's Day trip to Iceland? Not this year. A violent windstorm with wind gusts locally 180 to 220 kilometers an hour is expected tomorrow, February 14th. That's from 111 miles per hour to 136 miles per hour. That's pretty exciting. Hopefully there's not too much damage occurring. We'll find out in the coming days. Air doesn't typically like to move up or down particularly rapidly. And that's because if you push air up, it cools quite quickly because it expands. And that makes it colder than the surrounding air at that altitude. And so it's relatively dense and it wants to sink back down to where you originally pushed it from. And also, if you were to push it down, it would compress and heat up quite a lot to probably be warmer than its surroundings. And then that would make it less dense and it would rise back up. However, the winds from those quite exciting headlines, these are horizontally moving winds. And horizontally moving air has, especially out in the featureless ocean where this storm is developing, they don't really have any impediments except for some friction with the ground or the ocean that they're moving on. And that friction ultimately causes some quite impressive waves if you have a strong enough wind blowing over a long enough distance. So, now that we've established that it's much easier to get air to move horizontally rather than vertically, let's look at some context to try to figure out why 920 millibars is such a big deal for atmospheric scientists. This plot from the final authority on all facts, Wikipedia, it shows the atmospheric pressure versus altitude, pressure on the vertical and altitude on the horizontal. So, average surface pressure at sea level is around 1,013 millibars. 1 millibar is about a tenth of a kilopascal here. And the pressure that they were talking about for this storm is right around here, which is 920 millibars, 92 kilopascals. Vertically speaking, that's equivalent to being about almost 1,000 meters up above the ground, or above sea level, or about 3,000 feet up, which is really astonishing that one can create such a big pressure difference horizontally. That's about a tenth of the total atmospheric pressure. That's a horizontal departure from the normal, which is... And to figure out why such a strong horizontal difference in pressure at the same altitude can cause such blustery winds, we shall turn to one of my favorite analogies of all time, scientifically speaking. If you wanted to tell me, or estimate, how quickly a ball would roll down a hill, what are some things that you would say would influence your guess? Well, there's how big is the hill, right? The taller the hill, the more the rolling ball has space and time to pick up speed. There's also the question of how steep the hill is. And the steeper the hill, the faster it'll pick up speed. And resisting that would be friction. but we established that over the open ocean, there aren't very many obstacles, and friction is relatively low, at least compared to if it were blowing over land. And in atmospheric terms, the difference in pressure is analogous to the difference in elevation between the top of the hill and the valley that the ball is rolling down into. The greater the difference in pressure at the same altitude, or in other words, the greater the departure from the normal, the faster the winds are. And if you were to concentrate that difference in a relatively small, over a very small area, then that would produce faster winds still. Here's another nice wiki image that will help us understand the concept of a contour map, or an isobars map, or an isotemperature map, or any other kind of map based on the same principles. Here, where you see, we can say that this is either a low or a high, depending on what the context is. And regardless of that, you can see that the lines of equal pressure or temperature or elevation here are closer together, and here they're farther apart. So there you go, right there. Again, closer together, because again, the difference in elevation, or in meteorological terms, the difference in pressure between each line is the same. But if you have the same, this is a simple slope thing, if you have this same vertical change, but it's over a smaller horizontal distance, then you have a steeper slope. Hey, not that hard. Although it is kind of hard to visualize initially if you're not used to it. And so here, where would you expect to find the fastest winds? Over here or over here? Well, they look to be about the same difference in pressure between this side and the bottom versus that side over there, but this side has a steeper slope. So I personally would hypothesize, you might even say theorize, that if these were isobars, then the steepest, strongest wind would be right over here somewhere. Probably right about here somewhere, depending again on the structure of the storm. Let's see if our guess is correct when we look at the weather map brought to you by windy.com. What a perfect name. And so here we have the storm in its most recent state. There's the central pressure, 925 millibars. I think it actually bottomed out at 920 earlier, according to the National Weather Service. And sure enough, here's some of the fastest winds that are being really driven into the British Isles right here. What's this color bar? Yes, so in the vicinity in kilometers per hour of maybe 70 to 90, almost 100 kilometers an hour. These are sustained winds, by the way, not gusts. Gusts should be even higher than that. So let us look at some numbers. This is one of my favorite websites, windy.com. So here we see the North Atlantic. There's Iceland, there's Greenland, here's British Isles, Scandinavia, Denmark, Germany. And the color scheme is wind speed in kilometers per hour. And the lines, the white lines, are called isobars. They're lines of equal pressure. Iso means equal. And so, sure enough, here's the center of the low right here at 934 millibars. I think it actually bottomed out at 920 millibars, which is about the same as the minimum central pressure of Hurricane Andrew in 1992 and of Hurricane Michael in 2018, which were two of the most powerful landfalling hurricanes in the history of the United States. Which is really an impressive accomplishment for a storm in this part of the ocean. And so, sure enough, we see that where the isobars are farthest apart, that's like where the hill is not very steep in pressure terms, and the wind speed isn't very much. Whereas down here, where the isobars are quite close together, you tend to see an increase in wind speed. Now, there are other things at play, like the structure of the storm and where exactly the energy is being concentrated. But this right here is the center of the low, which is ultimately providing most of the driving force behind these winds. Also quite interesting, let's see, this was at Sunday at 12 a.m. Also quite interesting, as we talked about earlier, is that you can see that the wind speeds tend to be quite high over the ocean, but greatly reduced when they come ashore. And if I had to guess, I would say that's because of the extra friction with land. The wind runs into lots of trees and mountains, especially in Scotland, lovely hills that I'd love to visit someday. And then over here, the winds pick right the heck back up again. Wow, look at that. 104 kilometers an hour. These are, again, sustained winds, so 104 kilometers an hour. If you were to stick your hand out driving in a car on the highway, driving the speed limit of 60 miles an hour roughly, or 65, you'd essentially feel no wind if you're driving in a car. So that's pretty crazy. This is pretty exciting, and it'll be interesting to see how this storm changes over time. I think it should end up decreasing in its strength. Let's take another look at that color bar again. Pretty powerful storm. And again, hurricanes tend to have their hurricanes like Katrina, while they're impressively large, they tend to have their strongest winds sort of around the center in the eye wall, but because of the structure of a mid-latitude cyclone, they tend to concentrate their highest winds at different locations. And of course, when Hurricane Katrina bottomed out, it was a Category 5 hurricane with maximum sustained winds in excess of 157 miles an hour. I think it maybe even reached 170. Whereas here, it looks like sustained winds are about 60 miles an hour, maybe a little bit more, depending on how high up you are. There are probably some mountain peaks over here that are getting some pretty powerful winds. But overall, this storm is looks like it's quite a lot larger than Hurricane Katrina, although it's also possible that my perception is off because this is the Mercator projection. I think they're using the Mercator projection for this map, which tends to exaggerate the area of places that are relatively close to the pole. So, let us summarize. Pressure differences and pressure steepness can drive winds. They're primarily responsible for driving winds, and while vertical movement of air is more complex, and a topic that should be saved for another video, let me know if you're interested, horizontal winds, although they are all linked, horizontal winds can move quite rapidly. So we saw with Storm Dennis that generally where the lines of equal pressure, equal surface pressure, the isobars, where they were closer together, that indicated a steeper pressure gradient, and sure enough, the winds were faster, generally speaking. And because pressure differences drive wind speeds, it is of meteorological interest for scientists to track how quickly does a storm intensify, how quickly does its pressure drop. And indeed, they came up with a category for explosive cyclogenesis called a bomb cyclone, wherein the central pressure drops 24 millibars or more in a single day. Whew, that's exciting in any place, including and especially the North Atlantic. Thank you very much for joining me on my first ever YouTube video. Coming up next, we shall explore just how large this cyclone was. How does it compare in area to some of those powerful Atlantic hurricanes that were mentioned earlier? And were there any finer details that I may have passed over, or even more devastatingly factual errors? Please leave those in the comments with citations as you can, and I will try to address them personally, and potentially in the next video. Storm Dennis, Part 2.